At the same time, we were in this hanging moment demographically, where we knew that birth rates had been dropping for decades. And that meant in a lot of the advanced world, we were rapidly running out of children. But we still had all kinds of adults that had not yet aged into retirement. So we had this massive block of workers and consumers that were driving every part of the economy that we would ever want to be driven. It wasn't sustainable because there were no children. But for about 35 years, we were in this glorious moment where all things were possible, where there's plenty of finance, where there were no security risks, and where anyone who wanted to play a part in the international trading system could, and it was backed up by just these massive waves of workers and consumers.
The Russian collapse on every point of contact has been so extreme and so total that it's very difficult for even people who follow this issue full time to keep track of what's going on. The very, very short version is that over the course of the last couple of months, the Ukrainians have advertised that they're going to launch a major invasion counterattack in the Kherson region in an attempt to reclaim that territory. And we're going to include a link here as to what they were thinking with that. But instead, the bulk of Ukrainian forces seem to have somehow snuck all the way across Ukraine and sucker punched the Russians. The Russians did deploy maybe 10% of their troops from their eastern front to the Kherson region in an attempt to resupply because they knew that's where the attack was going to be, and as a result, they were unprepared for the Ukrainian assault. Back at home, economically, and on the battlefield, and it all really comes back to the Russian demographic. The Russian system has faced a number of serious trials and tribulations over the course of the last century. The defeat in World War I gutted a whole generation of young men, which then was insufficient to repopulate, and that generation, the following generation, was gutted in World War II. Khrushchev forced everybody into condos, which reduced the birth rate. Brezhnev presided over a decade of stagnation, which reduced the birth rate. And then ultimately, with the Soviet collapse in 1989, we entered a decade period where the birth rate halved and the death rate doubled. That has generated a massive demographic bomb within the Russian system, and there simply are no longer enough Russians remaining to repopulate the country over the course of the next 30 years. So one way or another, Russia is going to vanish as an ethnicity this century, and one of the major reasons why the Putin government decided that now was the time to launch the invasion of Ukraine is if they didn't do it now, they were going to lose the capacity to do it at all. But there's more going on here than raw numbers. A couple things. First of all, the Russian system educationally is a little bit different from how it is here in the United States. So here you go to high school, you go to college, you enter the workforce. In Russia, you go to high school, and after that you get an apprenticeship rather than university training as a rule. And you are an apprentice for 5-6 years before you then become a skilled craftsman or accountant or whatever it happens to be. Now, back in the mid-1980s, when the bottom really was falling out of the Russian system, the Russians ceased investing in technical education for everyone. If you were connected to the party, you might still be able to get an education, but for most people, it just stopped. It was replaced with ideological indoctrination, which is part of the reason why so many Russians today who are older look at what's going on in Ukraine and just see it as par for the course. They don't have an objection to it because they never received kind of the broad spectrum education that you would get in math and economics and engineering and so on. They were literally raised on the propaganda of the Soviet period. But it also means that the apprenticeship system collapsed. And overall, from roughly 1985 to 1995, the Russian industrial base just stopped. And it's never really come back. And so you have a hard cutoff about 1985 for the last time Russians were educated in large numbers. The Ukrainians so far have basically destroyed all functional Russian military formations in the Kharkiv province in the country's east, and they are now in the process of doing some mopping up and moving into Luhansk and Donetsk, which were those two provinces that the Russians invaded back in 2014 and declared to be independent republics. The government of Luhansk seems to have dissolved, and the military of the Luhansk Republic, which is the legal fiction that the Russians created to justify the current invasion, seems to have dissolved as well. The Russians are not retreating. This is not moving your tanks in orderly formations to get to a more defensible border. The military has crumpled. Izium, which was the location that the Russians spent the last 2 months trying to seize and ultimately did, and it has been the forward military base for most of their operations in eastern Ukraine, has been captured by the Ukrainians, and not just captured intact. The Russians did not even get on trucks to try to drive away because the Ukrainians were using drones to hit trucks on the highway. They simply left their equipment and ran, and it appears in most cases the only reason that the Ukrainian assault is not happening more quickly is that they are waiting for Russians on foot to run to the next town, tell everyone that the Ukrainians are coming, so that those troops can get off their equipment and run. So we're not just seeing a broad-scale collapse of the entire Russian military position in these areas. We are seeing them abandoning every piece of equipment that they have brought in and stored up for the last 6 months as part of their effort to go on to the rest of Ukraine. So in the case of Izium specifically, that is enough tanks, artillery, ammo, and fuel to supply 10 to 20,000 men, making it the single biggest arms transfer we have seen since World War II in the days of Lend-Lease. It's just that it's from the Russians to the Ukrainians. That one day has transferred more weapons to the Ukrainian military than everything that NATO has done to this point.
So the Russian strategy for all of its wars has always been about numbers. The Russian core territories are very, very poor, not in resources necessarily, but the weather is awful. So if you're talking agricultural output per acre, it's among the lowest of the major agricultural producers. And that means that the strategy the Russians have to use is not necessarily for high value added equipment in order to prosecute their wars, but instead for just mass numbers, human wave tactics, subjecting their foes to just wave after wave after wave of poorly skilled, poorly trained, poorly equipped soldiers until the numbers win the day. Now, the Industrial Revolution changed the math of this somewhat, because once you get to the Industrial Revolution and things like steel and railroads and machine guns, movement becomes easier and faster. You can deliver damage at range, and so you can become a little bit more precise. But in the case of Russia, it hasn't been as much of a game changer as you might think, because most of the countries that Russia borders have industrialized deeper and more quickly, going back to the dawn of the Industrial Revolution itself, and there's no exception there today. So it's still a numbers game. The problem is human wave tactics don't work when the other side doesn't simply have machine guns, but artillery and air power. And because of the Russian incapacity to train and because of their logistical incompetence, now on the Eastern Front, in places like Donetsk and Luhansk, in most battles, the Ukrainians are fighting as a near-peer power. They've managed to capture enough Russian equipment that the Russians are no longer enjoying a 10 or 20 to 1 artillery ratio. It's something much more close to even. So we've already had some reports that some of the draftees have gotten 1 day of instruction and then were shipped off to the front and have already charged into the Ukrainian lines and gotten massacred almost to a man. How reliable those reports are at this point, it's a war zone and it's Russia, so we really don't know, but it does kind of fit the historical pattern. Second, there's another aspect to the revolution and how it has empowered the individual. It's not just about tanks, it's about passenger cars.
The Russian demographic is so far beyond terminal that I've long thought that this was going to be their last war. Now, they still have the numerical advantage over Ukraine, which is even in a worse demographic situation. So in a fight between two maimed countries, Russia still has all the cards. But we now know from the way this war has been carried out that the Russian military equipment manufacturing capacity is nil. Most of that money's been stolen. We know that Russia's in-place capacity to train new troops is nil. We know that that has all been stolen. And we know that they're now relying on imported weapons from places like Iran and North Korea, which are not synonymous with scale and quality. And so if this is the situation the Russians are in, where their population's dying out, their youth generation is their last one, and they might not even be able to equip or train anyone they get, this could very well be the end. Do not count your chickens before they hatch, because Ukraine is in exactly the same situation. And if something happens to the weapons pipeline from the West, there's only so much equipment that the Ukrainians can capture from the Russians before it's all back in Russia proper. So, does that mean there's a lot of cross currents? Yeah, that's where we are. This is not just a normal fog of war. This is fog of war when most of the assumptions that we were all operating on have proven to be wrong.
The biggest panic, the biggest damage that we are seeing from the Ukraine war, outside of Ukraine, obviously, is in China. Because in 1 month, the Russians have pulled back the blinders on what has been a 50-year strategic program. The idea that China can become the global power with American sponsorship, with American indifference, that it can take Taiwan, that it can intimidate Japan, that it can dominate all of East Asia, and yet not suffer economically at all. It was always ridiculous, but now it's been shown to just be absolutely stupid. Now, the question moving forward, of course, is what's the next thing the United States is going to care about? And considering how erratic our politics have been for the last 15 years, that's a tough question, but it's something that every single country that trades now has to obsess about if they want to continue doing anything along the lines that they thought they could. And the yuan is only traded internally because it's the most manipulated currency in history. The euro confiscates bank deposits to pay for bailouts. Are there things that the Fed could do better, in my opinion? Of course. But compared to all the competition, I mean, there isn't any competition. Russia is the world's second largest oil exporter, and it exports via 4 main routes, one to China, one to the Baltic Sea, one to the Black Sea, and then on via pipe to Europe. What's going on right now because of the Ukraine war is that the pipes that go to Europe are going to be disrupted either by the war itself or because Ukrainian partisans are targeting Russian income flows. One way or another, those pipes aren't surviving this year. The stuff that goes to the Black Sea is in a war zone. So insurance companies will not give the indemnification that is necessary for vessels to operate in that area. So the only way a ship can go and dock at Novorossiysk right now is if a country gives its sovereign indemnification and takes all the risk. Some of that is happening with the Chinese. It might be happening with the Indians. That's a little touch you can go. They're still under negotiation. Primorsk, that's the Baltic port, so right next to St. Petersburg. That is not in a war zone. So you can get insurance to go to Primorsk. However, ship captains, for the most part, are refusing to go, and European dock workers are refusing to unload the cargo when it arrives.
Putin, like Xi, is likely to preside over the end of his country. Now, ruling the Soviet system / Russian system isn't nearly as much of a challenge as you might think. Yes, you've got billions of restive minorities. Yes, your national security strategy rests upon basically enslaving them and turning them into cannon fodder. But you do so via a very simple method. You use an intelligence service that infiltrates everything within your country, and whenever there is a hint of dissent, you stamp it out lethally and quickly. And when you have a system like that, you basically base your government on information control. And as long as the security apparatus is functioning, you can then press gang the entire population to do whatever you want. It's not particularly efficient from an economic point of view, but Russia has existed for nearly 4 centuries in its current form, more or less, and it put into position a kind of strategic stability within the country that is fairly durable. Now, the Putin government is the successor of a coup that happened in the Soviet Union in 1982. At that point, in 1982, the KGB basically overthrew the other factions within the Soviet ruling coalition within the Communist Party.